of those principles in action. I think all three of the papers are really excellent work in exploring comics in relation to a range of different media and to trying to get more and more specific in understanding the kinds of interrelationships that exist between media. That I think we're pushed, the paradox is, as we're exploring the blurring of lines between media, we're also exploring medium specificity. And there's a lot of focus in these papers on medium specificity that comes out precisely now that we see comics in dialogue with dance or theater or interactive game experiences or films, we can start to see what they have in common and how they differ. And I think that may be a way out of some of the problems about medium specificity that people like Noel Carroll has done a really interesting set of essays critiquing the notion of medium specificity. People don't know those essays. They really should, because it really breaks that concept down, and you're left, once he's demolished about 5 different versions of media specificity, you're left thinking this is a dead concept. But I think, in fact, comparative work in media revitalizes it by saying, all right, there could be all kinds of relationships across media, and if we can map the affordances of different media, we can therefore understand each media well and also understand how they contribute to each other. Now, calling the panel transmedia sort of connects it to the larger conversation that transmedia is evoking, not just here at Comic-Con, but across a variety of industry sectors, academic sectors, and so forth. And I'd say the last year, as transmedia has become more and more visible as a concept, we've seen more and more heated debates about its boundaries. So I thought by way of my response, I'd say a little bit about the concept of transmedia and how relate a bunch of things in comics to it that might help clarify a little bit some of the debates that have been going on out there. So for me, transmedia by itself refers to the idea of across media, right? A set of connections between media. And there can be any number of different kinds of connections across media. Transmedia logics is the word. Transmedia storytelling, which is what I've mostly written about, is one of those logics. Well, we can talk about transmedia performance, we can talk about transmedia branding, we can talk about transmedia ritual. All of them describe very different relationships of things that are logically constructed, play across media. We can talk about style as transmedia. What does it mean to move style from one medium to another? So within those terms, then, if we zero in on transmedia storytelling for a minute, transmedia storytelling, one form of a transmedia logic within storytelling would be adaptation, right? The literal copying of one story into another. That's not what I think people talking about transmedia storytelling really mean most of the time. And in my own work, I've tried to distinguish between adaptation and extension. Extension being based on the idea that something's added, that there's a logical acknowledgement of each of those media platforms and the connections between them. So transmedia storytelling would be about a logic of dispersal of pieces and integration of pieces, in which each of those pieces adds something new to the experience of the whole. So some of what we described here would, from my mind, be adaptation, but not, or remediation, but not another word that's commonly used that refers to the movement of stories or images across media platforms. That's Grusin and Walter's concept. Some of it is true extension in the sense that we're seeing the pieces connected together. So as I think about transmedia storytelling, and if you continue my mapping of the field here, and I'm sorry I don't have graphics to show this more explicit, but if we think about transmedia storytelling, there are a bunch of elements that we might imagine being in place. The first of these is seriality, right? And seriality would be within a single medium platform, within a single text, there's the unfolding of multiple stories over time that are connected to each other. So comics, we could think about the distinction between early comic books, which are self-contained, and subsequent comic books that are serial, and therefore a story unfolds week by week. Think Walking Dead as a kind of example of a really highly serialized comic that does a great job of building backstory and foreshadowing and so forth, exploits the property of seriality quite well. So seriality by itself does not make something transmedia because seriality exists within a single medium platform. Next out from that would be what I would call radical intertextuality. That is the connection of multiple texts with each other for the purposes of building out a world or an experience. And radical intertextuality would be like the DC or Marvel universes, right? Where multiple books, multiple characters, multiple protagonists can interconnect their stories across them. And I would say something like Civil Wars did a really great job of connecting, using the fact that we identify with multiple characters in multiple books, but when we read across the books, we add up to come something bigger than any individual book. So that we see characters we care about pit against each other in a debate that unfolds across multiple stories. And that's radical intertextuality. We can add to that something I would call, add to the notion of multiple modality. Right? Is it multiple modality? Modality is Gunther Kress's term, a semiotician who's written about the relationships between media. Multimodality would be film, television, dance, comics. Pick any combination of those. So what does Spiegelman gain by telling a story that's partially in comics, partially in stage? Or how does that performance literature just talking about exploit properties of comics and properties of dance, of liveness and stillness and so forth in relation to each other? So I would say it only becomes transmedia narration when it combines those three levels. That is, seriality, radical intertextuality, and multimodality are the building blocks of a transmedia narrative. Because I've been struggling in my own work thinking about these terms lately between the fact that, all right, what does it really matter? Because a lot of people have sort of reduced transmedia to just being in multiple media platforms. And if you're simply on multiple media platforms and there's no intertextuality and there's no additive comprehension, then what you're really that is a franchise, right? That's franchises as you've traditionally seen it. It's kind of redundancy between different media, the notion of novelization would be an example of that, or comic book adaptations of films and vice versa. Christy Dina has been sort of arguing that any adaptation has additive elements to it. If we move from the printed page of Harry Potter to the movie Harry Potter, all of the work of the art director adds dimensions to the story. So there's no absolute distinction between adaptation and extension, but it's fairly important to think about those distinctions. Nevertheless, there are two poles of a continuum, is what I would argue, as a way of responding. So pure adaptation would be an impossibility. A purely redundant adaptation may be an impossibility. Pure extension is probably logically an impossibility. But somewhere the continuum in between is where the action is and where things that are interesting are going on. The other part of the current debate speaks to what Patrick was talking about, which is ARGs. Right? So when I wrote in Convergence Culture about transmedia, I started by using the matrix as a primary example, and then I grafted into it in a sidebar the beast, right? And I just sort of papered over the relationship between those two modes because they're just juxtaposed side by side on the same page in my book. I sort of said there's something going on at that point. These are two kludges, to go back to the phrase, the passage you quoted before. Two ways we're combining media at the same time. They have something to do with each other. Well, now we're at the point where those relationships are really coming home to roost. And if you read the blogs around transmedia, you're seeing people struggling with, is an ARG transmedia or not? And I think the issue boils down to this question of, in the matrix, you've got multiple texts that add up to a whole. In an ARG, you have a single text that's constructed by multiple media. So one is multiple modalities within a single textual structure that has its own integrity. The other sort of pushes the radical intertextuality side a lot further. But I would hold on to the idea they're both doing something similar. To me, it's, I think there's an important distinction to be made between these different kinds of texts. But I think there's also a value in reading them side by side because they're both playing with how do we combine multiple media to create a narrative experience that we collectively put the pieces together. And so I want to hold on to the connections between them while acknowledging that they're doing somewhat different things. And so as I look at this panel, it's sort of, people are taking different slices of that, right? Each of the examples that we've seen work through here are different combinations of media to establish different kinds of multimodality, different kinds of intertextuality, and different kinds of relationships expected. We're asking different things in each of the examples that we've heard up here. And I think that's really helpful for us to try to sort through the pieces on that level. I'm hoping this isn't too complex or jumbled, but that I'm trying, this is stuff I'm still struggling with myself, even having helped develop a concept of transmedia. Because what we're seeing is lots of different people writing about lots of different kinds of text in a moment of transition. Those people are writing with different vocabularies from different disciplines and different sets of practices for different purposes, for different audiences, and so all of that is pulling the experiment in a lot of different directions. But I think if we all loosen up and have a flexibility and say, we're exploring what the kludges are that emerge in a moment of transition where this stuff is coming into being, then we can actually coexist and try to understand the value of these different models.
Henry?
Yeah?
We have to call it.
Okay.
We're into the buffer, so.
All right, well, let me end there.
And I apologize, we do not have time for questions. There's a panel after this.